because I dropped the anthropometer. And they were afraid what would happen next if I had to take it again.
Good afternoon. Today is April 25th, 1984. And we are here in Berkeley, California at the University of California. I'm Charles Wagley from the University of Florida Department of Anthropology. The Wenner-Gren Foundation for Anthropological Research and the University of Florida Anthropology Department are recording a series of videotapes on the history of anthropology for the use of students and researchers in the field. We're very fortunate today to have Professor Elizabeth Colson, a very distinguished anthropologist. We will be talking about early influences that have shaped her career, how her ideas and projects developed, and of her students in the field. I'd like to start the discussion by asking Dr. Colson a question. Where did you take your undergraduate degree, and how did you get the idea of becoming an anthropologist?
Like most youngsters, I wanted to be an archaeologist. And so I wrote to the University of Minnesota before I ever got there and said I wanted to come, and I went. At Minnesota, the archaeology was in the anthropology department. The consequences were that I had to take a great deal of other things besides archaeology, and wound up, because my first chance to do some field work came in cultural or social anthropology, I wound up as a cultural or social anthropologist rather than an archaeologist, and realized later that I could not have been an archaeologist because I suffer from the fear of heights, and I could never have stood. I could never have stood on those trenches and looked down. It hadn't occurred to me early on.
It's curious. My first experience, I wanted to be a social cultural anthropologist. I got a fellowship, and my first summer field trip was in archaeology. And I decided I wasn't an archaeologist. But who was teaching at Minnesota?
Jenks was the chair, and Wilson Wallace was the other professor in the department. Then when Jenks went off during the winter, his courses in archaeology were taken by Lloyd Wilford, who did his PhD at Harvard and spent his life at Minnesota. He was appointed to the department after Jenks retired, at the same time that David Mandelbaum and Walter Klein were appointed. That was at Minnesota. That was in '39. My first year in graduate school at Minnesota. So I did my BA.
And MA?
And then I did the MA. While at the same time I was the secretary of the department. That's the way I earned my living.
You know, at Columbia, a series of people like Ruth Bunzel were Boyes' secretary. And finally Boyes got tired of having secretaries going into anthropology. And he interviewed several people and said, "Are you interested in anthropology?" And they say, "Fascinating." "Well, I don't want you." Finally found somebody who said, "I don't know what it is." And so that was his last secretary. So then, so you knew generally what you wanted to do even before.
Yes.
And how did you get to move from Minnesota to Radcliffe Harvard?
At that time, Minnesota only gave the MA. And so to go on for the PhD, I had to go elsewhere. I applied at Columbia and Yale and Radcliffe and Chicago. And as it worked out, it was best financially to go to Radcliffe, and I also took into consideration the fact that at Radcliffe Harvard, they did not require the publication of the dissertation, which was a major financial handicap to many of us at that time.
Yes, people who were actually my teachers didn't have formally have the PhD, Gene Wellfish and so forth.
And Al Lesser for many years.
Al Lesser for many years, and he was my teacher. I think I got my doctorate before my teacher, thanks to Elsie Cleese Parsons. Then, who was at, we were talking, it was, Hooten was still teaching.
Yes, Hooten was there and Kuhn. Tazer was still there. Kluckon was there. And I worked primarily with Kluckon, though I had to take courses with Kuhn and I took a course with Hooten and with Kuhn in anthropometry to cover the physical anthropology for which we were held responsible, with Tazer, and also I worked with Helmovius in prehistory, because we were expected to know prehistory, physical anthropology, and then we could know some other things too.
Were your colleagues, were you the only woman, or how many women were studying at Harvard?
At that time, Marie Wormington Volk, who'd already done a year at Radcliffe, had come back to continue to work on her PhD. She's a well-known archaeologist, as you know.
In Denver, wasn't it?
Denver.
Yes.
And then I think, goodness, I've just mentioned her name.
Rooster?
She was just finishing up.
She was just finishing up.
And then there were a couple of other people there who I can't remember at the moment. But Marie and I were the ones who were really specializing at that, were at that stage of our career, just at that time.
You were in anthropology, not social relations.
I was in anthropology, not social relations, because social relations did not come in until 46.
Until 46.
When I already had my degree. On the other hand, since my interests, under the influence of Mandelbaum and others, had developed towards personality and culture in those days, and towards social anthropology, I took work with in the psychology department, and also in sociology.
Murray, is that the name?
I didn't work with him. I worked with Irving Child, who was
Irving
there.
Child, yes, I remember. He was a major figure at that time. And well, I met Kluckholm, whom I like very much, because he came down to New York to the Linton Cardner seminar every week. I was a bachelor, and and I had a small apartment. And Clyde had a key, just moved in, and he was a very exciting guy.
That must have been 1939-40, because I was just coming back in 1940 when I went to Radcliffe.
Yes, I think it was the first year, or 41.
Well, no, see, he was there 41, because that was the year I was at Radcliffe.
Because I was in Brazil 39-40. And the old story is that in the beginning at Harvard, that women had to sit in the hallway to listen to lectures. Was there anything to that story?
There was an arrangement. If a course was offered for Harvard graduate students, Radcliffe graduate students could participate in it, take it for credit.
And actually sit in the room.
And sit in the room and be fully recognized. If it were offered for both Harvard graduate and undergraduates, then Radcliffe women of any status could not take the course. If it were offered only for Harvard undergraduates, then Radcliffe women of any status could not take the course. Now, there were one of the courses that Kluckholm was teaching. He was also offering over at Radcliffe for Radcliffe students, and I took that course at Radcliffe. Another course that he was teaching, I think it was the course on the history of theory. He was teaching for Harvard graduates and undergraduates and was not offering at Radcliffe. He allowed me to come and sit in on that course. I could sit in the room, but I was not to say that I was in it, nor could I ever put it on any transcript that I had the course. But Mary Ellen Goodman, who came, I think, just about the same time, she was asked to sit in the hall. I think this was for one of Tazer's courses.
This story, was part of anthropology, part of the anthropology folklore.
Well, it was also a Radcliffe graduate student could use the stacks in the Harvard Main Library, Widener Library.
Widener.
You could, and there was also in the Widener Library a small reading room for Radcliffe students. You could use the reference room if you stood up. But if you sat down to consult a dictionary or anything else, you were immediately asked to leave.
You were breaking the rules. Huh? Well, we had, Columbia was very slow in integration, but I had to get permission to take a course at Barnard. And there was and the other thing at Columbia was, after I had been an instructor for 1 year, I wanted to go away, and Marion Smith was the obvious person to take my place while I was away. But no woman had ever taught in Columbia College. And they fought that. And Marion broke the rule. They got permission. But Columbia is still stronger, because the Radcliffe Harvard, it was quite a success now.
They joined up, but it was during World War II. They were using Radcliffe women as teaching assistants. But I believe the first woman to hold a teaching appointment at Harvard, which also meant the only teaching appointment in Radcliffe, was when they established that special
Zemery chair.
Yes, the Zemery stone chair.
Stone chair.
Which Cora Dubois held at one point.
Yes, I was always mad at Cora because we were trying to hire her at Columbia. And in the midst of this, Clyde Clarkholm got in touch with Cora and hired her away with the special chair. This was Doris Stone's father.
Yes.
I think that established the first chair.
United Fruit.
United Fruit. And Doris Stone is a very good anthropologist herself. And she studied at Radcliffe.
Yes, she was a Radcliffe
student. She was a Radcliffe student. Well then, what did you do your dissertation on?
I'd already done 3 summers of field work with the PUMO here in California. This was the New York University Field School under Bert and Ethel Aginsky. And I'd used that material for an MA. And also written up life histories from it, which I published later. This I did for Clyde Clarkholm. But for the dissertation research, I went to Nia Bay on the Makah Reservation and spent a year there. See, I had a Radcliffe Traveling Fellowship, and then finished up with an AAUW Traveling Fellowship, which also allowed me then, supported me when I went back to Radcliffe to start writing up the dissertation.
And how did you get to Africa?
Well, that came much later.
Much later?
I'd already...
Did you teach in between?
No. After I left Nia Bay, instead of going immediately back to Radcliffe, I went and spent 10 months working under Alexander Layton in the post and relocation camp for Japanese.
Yes.
That's where I encountered Ned Spicer,
yes,
who was full of Radcliffe Brown and Chicago, and I found it much more congenial to me than culture and personality, which I learned I really couldn't do. And from Poston I went back and finished the PhD at Radcliffe. But to get out to Africa?
Well, I mean, I just, but I didn't know that you worked with Alexander Layton.
Yes.
And Ned Spicer in that. And this begins to take a form as one changes. Of course, personality and culture had reached its height at the...
Yes, and I think we'd learned by then one had to know a good deal more than one could get from a few courses in anthropology to do very much with it. And I just didn't have, as far as I could see, the appropriate training to do anything very much with that kind of material.
I came back from Brazil and had my material on the Tupirapé and reported to the Cardner Linton Seminar, and Abraham Cardner said that he couldn't do anything with it. I didn't know enough. And I had not been working on that problem particularly, and I disagreed so much with Cardner when he made interpretations that I withdrew. And I suddenly felt that I wasn't made for that. particularly. Now, Cora did a lot of work to
she
prepare
retooled.
herself, retooled to work in that field. But how did you get to Africa?
I was finishing my PhD and I wanted a job. You know the feeling.
I've heard.
And I was looking around, and the British at that point had a very nice custom of advertising positions.
Yes.
The Rhodes-Livingstone Institute in Central Africa was advertising for anthropologists as research officers. And I had done, for my generals at Harvard, I'd used Africa as one of my areas, and done work with Walter Klein. So I applied, and I got the job.
Yes, you got. Was that at the Livingston Rhodes?
Rhodes-Livingstone Institute.
Yeah, Rhodes-Livingstone. Was Monica Wilson there?
No, Godfrey Wilson had been the first director.
Yes.
But he resigned in '42 and died before I ever reached Africa. He was followed by Max Gluckman as director. Max was director, I believe, from '42 until '47 when he resigned to go to Oxford as senior lecturer. And he was director when I reached Africa.
But Monica Wilson did work there sometime.
She did not hold a job there, but she worked with Godfrey on that Broken Hill study.
Yeah.
They had come down from what was then Tanganyika, where they'd been carrying out the work among Nyakusa and Ngandi.
Yeah. I met her in New York and remember talking all one evening. All of a sudden, I said, "My God, this is Monica Hunter." Because she had introduced herself as Monica Wilson, and she had written a very famous book that we all read as graduate students.
Reaction to Conquest.
Yeah, Reaction to Conquest. And so I didn't know who I was talking to. But
I first met Monica in '46. I'd just reached Africa, and Gluckman had arranged for us to spend a month at the University of Cape Town with Shakira, and also doing some work in basic Bantu linguistics. He also arranged for me to go, after the course was over, for me to go over to Fort Hare, where Monica was teaching then. This was the University for Africans and Indians. And I spent a week with her, being briefed on how one did fieldwork in Africa.
She did her work in Great Britain, of course.
She had did her BA at Cambridge, and also did the PhD there. But she had gone up to LSE to work with Malinowski, as everybody did at that time. And in doing the Pundo study, she was advised much of the time by Winifred Hernley, who was a major influence on the development of anthropology because she trained so many of the South Africans.
She did.
Hilda Cooper, Max Gluckman, Ellen Hellman, Jack and Eileen Cricket, and also had something to say in the training of Isaac Shapiro.
Good heavens.
Yeah.
What and so you spent how long at the Institute?
I spent a year there, my first year of field work.
And you did field work for them?
I did field work among the Plateau Tonga. I'd expected to go to the Luapula River, where Ian Cunnison later went, and got on the ship going out to Africa thinking I was going to the Luapula. Gluckman met me in Cape Town with the information I was not to go to the Luapula, but to the Plateau Tonga. The district commissioner said that it was bad enough being on an international boundary with criminals hopping back and forth, and he wasn't going to put up with a woman to add to his troubles. So they sent me to the Plateau Tonga, who lived on the railway line.
And you've been working in that general area?
Ever since, off and on.
Off and on.
Yes.
Did you plan long-term research?
Not at that point, though of course I was interested in the idea. Clyde Colquhoun had already started
his long-term
RAMA study, and I had, as a research assistant for Colquhoun, I'd worked on setting up the files in the RAMA project. So it was certainly in the back of my mind.
So it was in the back of your mind. It wasn't a new something that just happened.
No.
You fell in love with the area.
Yes.
Obviously.
Yeah.
Don't you think that anthropologists do fall in love with, so to speak, with the people?
Not always.
Not always, but a lot of people do.
There's one anthropologist who spent his first year working with the people, saying to himself, I love them, I have to. They're my people, and an anthropologist always likes the people. A couple of years later, he went to another group, and then but I didn't like those people at all, and they were thoroughly nasty, and nobody would have liked them, including an anthropologist. But he could only face that when he got among the people whom he genuinely liked. And the other ones, he simply could not get on a common wavelength with them.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that for people who stay the way you did in the general area, generally find something sympathetic. And I didn't particularly fall in love with the Guatemalan Indians, but my Brazilian Indians, I felt very much at home, and I loved Brazil. In fact, Brazil treated me well, and I just kept going back year after year. And I got to know the people, as you did, as a very exciting group.
And it's interesting watching what happens next.
Yes.
So sad sometimes.
Now, you must have been influenced by British social anthropology.
Yes, but I have some
with
Ned Spicer.
And what do you think of it today?
I think it still provides the basic points where it's very useful to start. Getting an idea of the foundation, of what people are doing, and its concentration on action, how people are interrelating. And once having gotten that, then there are all sorts of other things which are very interesting to do. There may not be very many theoretical issues in working on those foundations, but they're the kind of thing that you have to know about if you're really going to do anything very interesting in other directions on a particular area.
One of your colleagues at University of California said that you gave a beautiful lecture last year on the importance of history. And what was your point?
Really in being able to look at what is happening over time, rather than trying to see it as existing in a single moment. As Radcliffe Brown was doing. On the other hand, I think one does start trying to figure it out from the point where you are when you first go there. But then you can understand the dynamics much better if you place it against a continuum of history.
Have you taken many students or sent many students to the Tonga area?
When we began the study of the Gwembe Tonga, in 1956, Thayer Scudder was a student at Harvard and was appointed to work with me on that. Chesley...
Just take a break. Right. It's about time for a break anyway.
I think was it Alice Bruce?
Hello. Later, Chesley Lancaster, who was a student here at Berkeley, went to work among the people who lived just south of the Gwembe Tonga. And so he went out after having worked with me. Then I think that's about it. A number of other students have gone to work in Zambia.
With Tonga.
But not with Tonga.
Not with Tonga. I think I asked you a very stupid question that this is not the same Tonga of Juneau.
No, it is not the Juneau Tonga. They're usually spelled with TH.
TH, yeah.
But the word Tonga is fairly common throughout this area of Africa. There are Tonga-speaking peoples in Malawi who were studied by Yaup and Belson, who are quite different again. And there are some Tonga-speaking peoples in the Zambezi Valley who may or may not be related to the people I had worked with.
Juno, I think, was on the edge of either in Mozambique.
He was in Mozambique.
Mozambique.
And his people are also sometimes called the Shangaan Tonga.
Oh.
Yes.
Because I did see Shangaan. I was in Mozambique once, and I was looking for Juno's Tonga, but I didn't find it. I just didn't. I was only there for 3 or 4 weeks. Shangaan. And after you began your work in Africa, you started teaching? Or you went to Manchester?
Well, it's a bit more complicated than that. After our first year of fieldwork, the trustees of the Institute could not provide us with housing while we did our first period of write-up. This was right after World War II, and housing was very, very short, as civil servants began to come out, and they took up all the housing available. So Max Gluckman had just gone to Oxford, and persuaded the trustees to send us with him. So we spent the year at Oxford. I was writing up, but John Barnes and Clyde Mitchell were writing up and also registered for degrees at Oxford. Since they had been in World War II in the British Navy and the South African Air Force, they hadn't gotten their degrees yet. So after that year,
actually spent
a year there, taking part in all the work at Oxford and going up to London to the Perth seminar, and then went back to the Institute where I was then director. I took over from Gluckman. And I was director of the Institute, continued to carry out fieldwork through from 1948 through August of 50, and then went on leave and went to Manchester as a Simon Fellow. We decided not to go back as director and stayed on as a senior lecturer at Manchester. So I was at Manchester 51 through 53.
Who was there?
Gluckman.
Gluckman.
And then, of course, he was bringing in various people to, we had almost no undergraduates. It was an ideal postgraduate, postdoc kind of arrangement. Various people were in training to go out to Africa to work at the Institute. Vic Turner, Jaap van Velsen, Bill Watson, other people who were students, graduate students, preparing to go elsewhere. Freddie Bailey, F.G. Bailey, Ronnie Frankenberg, Peter Worsley during those years. And then coming back would have been John Barnes, who had just been up to Norway to start the Bremnes study and beginning to develop his ideas on networks. He spent, I think, a term or a year with us. And Clyde Mitchell came up from the Institute where he'd taken over from me as director. George Homans came over. Ed Shills came over. And Shamo Srinivas spent a term with us. So
it was a very exciting
And then
group.
we would have other people come who were just back from the field come up and present their data, like the Bohannons, John Middleton, Elizabeth Watt came down and presented her work on families in London. And any number of people came.
So we were an active place at the time.
It was very active and a constant working through of field material, which is one of the best trainings the students got.
You didn't plan to stay, or did you want to come back to the United States?
I thought if I were going to come back to the United States, it probably was a point when I should try and come back. And so I was offered...
It sounds like a very exciting group, and with Max Gluckman and all these people around.
And much more exciting than being the only anthropologist at Goucher College.
Well, you went to Goucher?
Yes. After all, in those days, a woman anthropologist usually found a job, if she found one, in a women's college.
Trying to think, which is probably true. And, of course, I think up in Columbia with Benedict and Meade around, I really expected women to be around.
Yes, but Meade didn't hold a regular teaching
No,
position.
well, she refused to hold one. She was invited to do so several times. But we did have, and some of the other women had
Excuse me.
troubles. College.
Yes.
And of course, we were talking about positions for women in the United States. I admit there was some difficulties. In fact, I think I've mentioned that Marion Smith had troubles of just teaching for 1 year in Columbia College. But Goucher has a very good reputation.
Yes.
Do you enjoy it?
Yes.
But it didn't sound like Manchester.
Many things about it were enjoyable. The chance to mix with people from a variety of departments, which was the setup encouraged. On the other hand, I was told that I would be lucky to get one student in 3 or 4 years who was interested in what I was interested in. So that encouraged me to take the offer of the job at Boston University in the African Studies program.
That was up and coming.
That was up and coming then.
At that time. Matter of fact, I think Hortense Pottermaker went to Goucher College.
She was an undergraduate there,
Yeah.
and I replaced, by the way, Harry Basehart,
Oh.
who taught at Goucher for a number of years before going back to Harvard.
Mm-hmm. Well, then you moved up to Boston. Which
I moved to Boston.
I know that was a growing place, and particularly the African studies was well developed.
Yes.
And of course, it's near Cambridge. A lot of things happening.
What a river separated us.
River and,
Although it was an interesting thing, just at that point, Harvard would allow credit for its students who who took courses at Boston University in the African Studies program, and would reciprocate with allowing our students to take courses at Harvard. This was not an arrangement that affected any other part of Boston University. This was how Thayer Scudder came to work with me. And I also had David Sapir come across the river to work with me, and a number of other people.
Of course, that Boston African Studies was part of the drive in the United States for area studies that was for improvement, and it was a sort of selected place to develop those Northwestern and the Perskivitz, and then I think Boston was...
Boston may not have been second. Howard may have been second in developing. But Boston certainly was developing fast at that point.
That was very early. A friend of mine, Daniel McCall.
Yes.
Was he there at the time?
He was there.
He was there. Very interesting person. He was at Columbia when I was...
Yes, and then worked in Ghana.
Then worked in Ghana. And you taught how long there?
I taught there 1 year, and then they asked me to go back to Zambia, to northern Rhodesia, to start the Gwembe study, because the people of Gwembe Valley were going to be displaced for the building of the Kariba hydroelectric dam.
Oh, yes.
And the then director, Henry Fosbrook, thought that there was going to be very rapid change. He wanted the ethnography recorded before that change set in, and he also thought it would be wonderful to have a before and after study. So the agreement was that we would come back in 4 to 5 years after the first study, after the people were moved, and do a follow-up study.
That was, Scudder was working with you on that?
Yes, and again went back in 62, 63 for the follow-up study.
The two of you wrote, published not long ago, only several years ago.
Yes, initially we wrote quite separately. The understanding has always been that we had copies of each other's field notes and could use those for writing anything we wished to. But it's probably only a recent, well, in 1970 I think we finally got around to writing our first joint article.
And then you're not a native Californian. And,
No.
and so how did you land here? And
Well,
Have you liked California?
Having come back from starting the Gwembe study, I was recruited by Brandeis.
Oh.
And I was teaching at Brandeis at the time when I went back for the second leg of the Gwembe research. And just at that point, things got rather awkward at Brandeis.
Yes.
This was the time when Kathleen Goff and David Averly were left. And I decided in the Gwembe Valley that I would leave too.
Rather in protest or solidarity, or?
I did not like the way things were going.
I know Brandeis had his troubles. I was very friendly with Robert Manners.
Yes.
And of course Vera Rubin was much interested in her husband and the development of Brandeis. But they were having troubles, and they were very upset about it. Didn't Paul Rabin come up?
Paul Rabin had been there before I went. Indeed, he died just before I went over to Brandeis.
And so you left Brandeis and...
I was in the Gwembe Valley, and I came back. Friends rallied around and got me a job for 1 year at Northwestern, and then a number of offers came, and I took the Berkeley one. So I came here in '64.
In '64.
And my first term was the free speech movement.
Oh my gosh. So you've been here now 20 years.
Yes.
Exactly. And of course Berkeley has grown. I'm not talking about numbers, I'm talking about anthropology. It's one of the largest departments in the United States, if not the largest.
I suspect it's grown by a third to a half during the time I've been here.
And so who are the students you had here that you remember best?
Let's see, Anya Royce, who's now at Indiana University. Bonnie Keller, who's now at the University of Zambia. John Abu, who is here at Berkeley.
Let's
see. Oh, goodness. There have been so many of them.
So many, it's hard to...
Nancy Williams, who's out at the Institute for Aboriginal Studies in Australia.
And what courses have you been teaching here?
I've been teaching, let's see, recently I've been doing the history and theory.
That's it.
I've been teaching in the first year seminar for graduate students, incoming graduate students in social cultural. George DeVos and I have been developing a seminar on the study of migration and forced resettlement, which grew out of an earlier seminar that I had taught on a similar subject, but it's now much expanded and a good deal of interest on the part of our students, some of whom indeed are trying to develop a program for such studies, very largely student organized and planned. Then let's see what else. I've taught on the Africa course, I've taught the religion course. I haven't taught the Native American ethnography course, North American ethnography course, probably now for about 10 years.
Well, one thing that we didn't go into enough, because it's not very well known, it's about the Japanese relocation. We didn't, there's some very important people worked on that, and Alexander Layton, yourself, and I think Solon Kimball
He visited and Conrad Ahrensberg visited Poston before I arrived. Oh, I never saw them there, but I think they were very much involved in the planning.
I think so,
and
we don't know very much about it. Could you tell us something about it?
I think Ned Spicer has described it. It was after the Poston Center was established that the War Relocation Authority decided to recruit anthropologists and sociologists for comparable work in other camps. And the Oplers worked,
Marvin
and Morris.
Morris.
David French followed us into the Poston camp. And there were a number of other people, anthropologists, who worked.
What did you do?
Well,
I mean, what anthropologists do, but I mean...
We went to staff meetings and recorded them. We went to the meetings of the Residents' Council and recorded that. I sat in on the negotiations at the time of the strike with labor leaders representing the workers and others representing management. We wandered around the camp and described what we could see. It was one of the things and what we were concerned with in part was the relationship between the administration and the way in which the people of the camp saw what was happening. Leighton thought that it might be a good idea if we tried to make some small, obvious return to the people in the camp. And so we planned a little booklet that could be given to them, which would concentrate upon one issue or one episode in each of the months that the camp had been established, and by this time it was about 10 months. And so we wrote them up. They were rather well done, I think. But then it turned out that in order to get it published, you had to get approval from all the different units in the government that were involved. And because Leighton was in the Navy, it had to be cleared with the Navy. Because it was on Indian land and the Indian Service was administering the camp under the War Relocation Authority, it had to be cleared with the Indian Service. And because it was under the War Relocation Authority, it had to be cleared with the War Relocation Authority. And as soon as you get it cleared with one agency, another one would decide that it wanted to take a second look. I left the camp, and I don't think that pamphlet was ever released.
Did you attempt, as anthropologists, to advise at least about cultural problems with the Japanese?
Well, that certainly was involved in...
I mean, cultural conflicts.
Well, that certainly happened in the informal sessions with the camp administrators. On the other hand, there were people who had come to the camp to work who probably knew a good deal more about Japanese Americans than we did. It wasn't only the anthropologists who were outraged at what was happening to the Japanese. The man who was head of the education program in the camp had been, I believe, the superintendent in a Honolulu school system, who said that imprisoning these people was just outrageous, and he was therefore going to come to make sure that there was somebody in the camp who was sympathetic to them and understood how they felt about things. And there were other people who came to the camp to work there who had the same kind of motivation.
I know it was a very... I've talked to Conrad Ahrensberg, who didn't have long experience there, and at the Center for Behavioral Sciences, I got to know Alexander Leighton, who told me a little bit about it, but just something that I think I'll look up in that Spicer's articles or a book.
Let's see. He and some others edited a book called, I think, People Behind Bars.
I think so.
I've forgotten just the title, and unfortunately I've just given it away to someone who wanted it. Well, since I'm having to dispose of much of my library, I've been giving books to various people.
Well, you are faced, like all academics and anthropologists, with field notes and books, and as I understand it, you're planning to retire very soon. And probably you have as many books at home as you have here.
Not quite as many.
But not much wall space left. That's
no wall space left.
And So what to do? And with field notes, what do you plan to do with your field notes?
Write them up.
Write them up. Then will you deposit them or they...
I have made an arrangement, let's see, I think I've left them in my will, to one or two places, but with the saying that whichever one agrees to the stipulation can have them. One is that the early notes shall not be available to anybody until the year 2000.
Yeah.
That will then be approximately 60 years after the last note was made. And for the Tonga notes, that they be not made generally available until, I think it's 40 years after the last note is added to the collection. That way, people are safeguarded.
The people in the...
Described in the notes.
Yes. But of course,
after all, an anthropologist writes notes very rapidly
I
in the
know.
field, and you don't go back and correct them, and there's lots of...
I've even used four-letter words
Yeah.
for shortening something, and people, I forgot it, but I did so and showed them the notes, and they were sort of shocked. To one secretary who was typing them. And you write very fast, you have to. I think that's very wise. Well, who do you consider the most, do you think Clyde Kluckholm or Max Gluckman was the most significant person in your career?
Why not Wilson and Ruth Wallace?
Well, that's true. Early.
Really?
But certainly that direction that you took was more like Kluckholm and
Gluckman, yes.
Your theoretical work and your field work.
I think both of them were important. But Kluckholm had an ability every now and then to make you think and to stimulate you. That was very exciting. Gluckman was more consistently, I think, working along lines that were congenial to me, but didn't have that, and was very stimulating also. But I think Kluckholm at certain times was more stimulating for me.
Well, he was, I never studied with Kluckholm, but I got to know him, as I said, and he asked me questions, and he was very good with young people. I was just beginning to teach as an instructor, and I remember his giving me some cues how I should teach and how I should present this. And he had a bit of charisma and very helpful to young people. I always missed him when he died really prematurely. And people don't talk about him so much anymore. Maybe at Harvard, but...
I wouldn't think even at Harvard.
No.
After all, it's the only one who's there now would be Voti.
Voti
who's
remembers
worked with
it,
him.
yes. And, well, what do you intend to do after you retire?
Exactly.
Now that I've just retired, maybe I can get some ideas from you.
I shall sleep. And 6 months after I've retired, when I'm rested and have sorted my books and gotten them into order again and all that kind of thing, that's the point when it begins to make sense to make further plans.
Make further plans. That's the stage I'm in. People ask me if I'm writing. I say yes, a little bit, but I have no great urge at this moment. But then next year I may be different. It may be different.
Well, during 6 months, as you know, we're haunted by the field notes, and there are things that we have to write up for them.
Yes.
So it doesn't really matter what we want to do. We know a certain number of things that we're going to have to do. So.
Good. Well, it's been a pleasure to be here, and one other question that I like to ask, because what would you advise young men and women to make anthropology as a career? at this time in our life?
No, but then Wilson and Ruth Wallace told me that I was very ill-advised to go into anthropology if I wanted a living wage. That there just weren't any jobs, and if I wanted to support myself, I should go do something else.
I think we were all told that. And someone said that they should be told, but if they're pig-headed enough to go, they're not good anthropologists, to go into anthropology.
Well, at least I don't think we should stop them from trying.
No, I think that, but I think that it's been a very exciting lifetime, and for me at least. And as one student said, but I look at you and you made a living.
We made a rather good living on it.
We made a decent living. So what I had told him about not coming into anthropology, if you wanted to eat, didn't believe. Well, it's been a pleasure to have the chance to talk with you, and it was very nice of you to give us your time.
Well, thank you very much. I've enjoyed it.
Because we're very anxious to get our distinguished colleagues in this series.